Good evening, everyone who is joining me today on this webinar, and welcome. And tonight, as I have mentioned already in the description, you have read about it. That's why probably you are joining. I don't want to show you the Mexico you already know. This will be a completely different story from my side, not the Mexico about resorts, influencer cafes, rooftop pools, or top 10 places you must visit. Honestly, not even the Mexico you can easily find on Google. Everyone can do that. Everyone knows how to do that, how to use Google search and other search engines. So this webinar is about something different. It's about the Mexico hidden between the tourist routes. The Mexico that slowly reveals itself when you stop rushing, stop overplanning, and start paying attention. Some of the places I'll talk about tonight don't even exist properly on travel blogs. Some are not on booking platforms. Some don't even look special at first glance, but they still stay with you. Because sometimes the places that change you the most are not the famous ones. They're the tiny roadside comedores hidden inside the chaotic market. The old man singing boleros and rancheros inside the nearly forgotten cantina. The jungle road covered in fog. The silent church where ancient beliefs still survive. The family that invites you to sit down for a mezcal and stories. Or a random stop you almost didn't make. The deeper I traveled through Mexico, the less interested I became in famous places. And the more interested I became in atmosphere, the vibe, the people, traditions, the hidden stories, strange moments, and the feeling of discovering something that feels real. Mexico is one of the few countries in the world where modern chaos and ancient worlds still exist side by side. And nowhere you can feel that stronger than in Mexico City, to be honest. Because Mexico City is not just a city. It's a multiple cities layered on top of each other. I don't know if you understand what I mean, but I will try to explain you. At every few streets, it changes personality completely. Most people arrive in Mexico City expecting three things: traffic, tacos, and museums, of course. And yes, all of that exists. But Mexico City is much stranger than people imagine. Because beneath the chaos, there's another vision of the city quietly hiding. A city of underground music scenes, forgotten rituals, hidden silence, or old cantinas, rooftop cable cars, ancient ruins swallowed by modern neighborhoods in places that feel completely disconnected from the outside world. First time Mexico City surprised me wasn't in a famous attraction. It was in silence. And that's not something you expect in one of the biggest cities on earth. Not far from the noise in Chapultepec Park, there's a hidden place called Audiorama. No loud music, no traffic chaos, no street vendors screaming. Just quiet. People sitting alone reading books. Soft ambient music between the trees. The sounds of birds instead of car horns. And somehow, inside one of the loudest cities in the world, you suddenly feel disconnected from it all. That's one thing Mexico City constantly does. It changes energy unexpectedly. One moment chaos, the next completely calm and peace. And honestly, that contrast is part of the magic. One of my other favorite ways to understand Mexico City is not from the streets, but from above them. Most tourists never take El Bus Linea Dos, but they should, because suddenly the city stops feeling like a tourist destination and starts feeling real. You float above endless neighborhoods, stretching towards the mountains. Colorful houses climbing hills, street markets, laundry hanging from the rooftops, football fields squeezing between buildings. And you realize Mexico City is not polished. It's alive, real, right there. And you would never visit those neighborhoods. And from above, you start understanding its scale. Not just physically, emotionally. Another thing happens on every Saturday. Another side of Mexico City appears. That's called Tianguis del Chopo. And it's not a tourist market. It's an underground world. Punks, metalheads, vinyl collectors, old band shirts, graffiti, heavy music through their streets. And what I love about places like this is that they remind that Mexico is not just mariachis and sombreros. It's rebellious, it's creative, it's alternative. It has subcultures most outsiders never expect. And honestly, wandering through places like this teaches you more about modern Mexico than many museums ever could. All right, enough with the small things. Now let's go to the silence and underground culture. Directly into the chaos again. Near Lagunilla Market, hidden between loud music, market stalls, and moving crowds, there's a tiny place many people walk past. without even noticing. Guerra drinks, called micheladas, plastic cups, music blasting into the streets, nothing fancy at all. But that's exactly why it's memorable. You stand there, surrounded by local music happening in every direction. People selling random antiques and junks, and families eating music from all over, different speakers, street vendors shouting, and for a moment you stop observing Mexico City as a tourist. You become part of its movement. You sit down, you grab big michelada and enjoy. You become part of it. That's a beautiful place. And now I want to take you to the different personality again of the Mexico City. That's Mercado Sonora. And it feels almost surreal the first time you enter it. The moment you walk in through the ordinary market corridors and suddenly you're surrounded by herbs, candles, spiritual cleansing, folk magic, skeletons, potions, snakes, rituals, deep connected to the traditions older than modern Mexico itself. This is the kind of place that reminds you Mexico's ancient beliefs didn't disappear. They adapted, they blended, they survived. And what fascinates me most is not even the market itself, but the hidden food corners nearby. Tiny comedors hidden deep between market stalls where workers, taxi drivers, and local people just eat lunch there on a plastic chair surrounded by steam, noise, and just daily conversations. That's created by food experiences. No food blogger ever will take you there. That's real daily life. And honestly, some of the best meals in Mexico happen in places where nobody speaks English and nobody is even trying to impress tourists. But there's another Mexico City most travelers never enter. Old pulquerias, old cantinas, places where time feels strangely frozen. I'm not talking about trendy cocktail bars. I mean old neighborhood places where old men still sit for hours drinking pulque, a drink older than tequila itself. Places where worn wooden tables, dim yellow lights, local music echoing softly in the background. Cantinas are the places where musicians still walk table to table singing their heartbreak songs, while waiters in old uniforms carry beer through the crowded rooms. It's real. It is there. Have you ever read about places like this in any travel blog? These places are disappearing slowly, and maybe that's why they feel so emotional for me. Because you're not just visiting a bar, you're stepping into a version of Mexico City that's quietly fading away. This is your chance to visit and experience it while it's there. But Mexico City also has another hidden personality that's modern, creative, experimental, industrial. Places like Ex Fabrica, for example, feels raw and constantly evolving. Art spaces, concert venues, hidden inside the old industrial buildings. Events that feels underground and temporary. A younger generation reshaping the city on its own way. And this is important. This is very important because Mexico City is not trapped in the past. It constantly reinvents itself. That tension between ancient and modern, traditional and experimental is what makes the city so addictive. But if Mexico City had a portal into another world, it might be the Museo Usanajocalli, built from black volcanic stone designed by Diego Rivera himself, filled with the pre-Hispanic influence. It doesn't feel like a museum. It feels very, I would say, ceremonial, a little bit heavy, dark, ancient. But suddenly you begin feeling something important. Mexico City was never fully built over the ancient world. The ancient world is still underneath it, still influencing it, still breathing through it. And that is another place where I want to take you. That is Cuicuillo, one of the oldest pyramids in Mexico, completely surrounded by modern city life. Cars passing nearby, shopping centers not far away, urban noise everywhere. And yet this ancient circular pyramid still quietly exists in the middle of modern Mexico City. You really ever heard about it? No one talks about it. Everyone talks about Templo Mayor, and most tourists never visit it. But standing there, it feels strange, because it really reminds you that Mexico City isn't simply modern. It builds on layers of collapsed civilizations, forgotten lakes, destroyed temples, and ancient memory. But after all that chaos, San Angeles feels almost unreal. Cobblestone streets, old trees, quiet plazas, volcanic stone architecture, and places like Tetetlan perfectly capture something I love about Mexico City. Its ability to hide calmness in unexpected places. The city constantly shifts loud to quiet, modern to ancient, chaotic to reflective. And that emotional instability is what makes it unforgettable. And there's a tree in Mexico City connected to one of the most painful nights in the Spanish conquest. The legend says Hernan Cortés sat beneath it and cried after his forces were defeated while escaping Tenochtitlan. Whether every detail is historically accurate or not almost doesn't matter anymore, because places like that reminds you history in Mexico doesn't feel distant, it feels alive. And the tree is right there. You can visit it, you can go there, you can sit next to it. Maybe the same place where Hernan Cortés used to. And this is where Mexico City slowly reveals its final hidden personality. Not chaos, not food, not nightlife, but memory. Ancient Mexico still exists underneath the modern city. Sometimes literally, sometimes spiritually, sometimes emotionally. And once you start noticing those layers, you never experience Mexico City the same way again. And maybe that's what surprised me the most about Mexico City. Not the size, not the chaos, but the feeling that ancient Mexico never fully disappeared. It still leaks through the cracks of the modern city, through volcanic stone, through rituals, through stories, through markets selling herbs and spiritual cleansings, only a few metro stops away from skyscrapers and traffic jams. And once you begin noticing these layers, you start seeing something very different across Mexico. Because in many places here, ancient beliefs are not treated as history. They are still alive, quietly blending into daily life, sometimes hidden inside churches, sometimes inside markets, sometimes deep in the jungle, and sometimes inside people. Some places in Mexico feel older than modern Mexico itself, not physically, emotionally. You feel it in the air, in the silence, in the rituals, in the way people speak about certain places with respect instead of explanation. And what fascinates me most is that Mexico never fully separated spirituality from everyday life. Ancient beliefs didn't disappear, they blended, mixed with Catholicism, with local traditions, with modern life. And the result is something incredibly unique. Not religion, not folklore, something deeper. And honestly, I'm not even a religious person, but there's a place in Mexico that genuinely made me feel spiritual in ways I never expected. One of those places is Xoquén, a small village in Yucatan that most travelers drive past without even knowing it exists. But for many local Mayan communities, this place carries enormous spiritual importance. Some believe this area represents the spiritual center of the Maya universe. And hidden there is Iglesia Crustun, a small church, very small, simple from outside, but emotionally very powerful. This is the kind of place where you realize Mexico is full of hidden spiritual geography. Tourists never hear about it. Not famous trademarks, secret places that quietly continue existing for the people who still believe in them. And what I love about places like Xoquén is that they don't feel performative. Nobody is trying to entertain tourists. Life simply continues there. Ancient stories quietly surviving inside ordinary villages. And then there is Chamula. And honestly, Chamula is difficult to explain properly unless you experienced it yourself. Because this is not just a church to visit, it's an emotional experience. Inside the church there are no posts, no traditional masses, no quiet European church atmosphere. The floor is covered in pine needles. Candles flicker everywhere. Families kneel on the ground performing rituals that blend Catholic saints with ancient Maya beliefs. People pray, heal, cleanse, whisper, cry. And the first time I entered this place, I remember feeling something very unexpected. Because I'm not religious, but somehow this place brought out a level of spirituality in me I never thought possible. Not religion, spirituality. That beautiful and mysterious blend of ancient belief and modern faith somehow still existing together in the same room. And for me, Chamula became one of the strongest reminders that Mexico is not just culturally different. It experiences spirituality differently, not as performance, as part of life itself. And then I want to take you to Catemaco. Probably one of the strangest places I've ever visited in Mexico. Catemaco is often called the epicenter of shamans of Latin America, a place surrounded by jungle, volcanic hills, lagoons, mist and stories that feel half real and half mythological. And honestly, some of the weirdest and scariest experiences I ever had in Mexico happened right here. I recently shared one of those stories on my social media because even now, years later, it still feels very difficult to fully explain it. And that's the thing about Catemaco. You don't always understand what's happening there logically. You feel it emotionally the moment you're peacefully crossing the lagoon by boat, and the next you're hearing stories about witchcraft, spiritual cleansings, jungle rituals, and shamans. People travel across Latin America to visit, and whether you believe in those things or not almost becomes irrelevant, because Catemaco has atmosphere, a very strange one. The kind of place that stays in your head long after you leave. One of the most powerful spiritual experiences I've had in Mexico happened inside a small Temazcal ceremony led by Cristina and Manolo. And what made it special wasn't luxury, it was sincerity. As Cristina guides you into the womb-like darkness of Temazcal hut, she leads the ceremony with songs that honestly feels hypnotic. And wow, she has one of the most beautiful voices I've ever heard during a ceremony. Meanwhile, outside, Manolo quietly takes care of the fire, constantly feeding it and keeping the volcanic stones glowing hot. And slowly the experience stops feeling like tourism. It becomes deeply personal. You sweat, you breathe, you listen, you disconnect from the noise. And for a while, the outside world completely disappears. I've experienced different temazcales across Mexico, but this one remains one of the most authentic, emotional, and memorable ones I've ever experienced. Not because it was dramatic, because it felt real, but there are towns in Mexico that people visit, and then there are places people feel connected to. Tepoztlan is one of those places, surrounded by mountains and deeply connected to the myth around Quetzalcoatl. This town has attracted artists, spiritual seekers, hikers, and curious travelers for decades. And even if you're skeptical about energy places, there is something about Tepoztlan that slows people down. Maybe it's the mountains, maybe the stories, maybe the vibe. But places like this reminds me that Mexico often exists somewhere between mythology and reality. And honestly, I think that's part of why people become emotionally attached to this country so much. And earlier, I mentioned the Mercado Sonora from the perspective of chaos and the city life. But spiritually, this place is fascinating too, because inside this noisy market, you'll find herbs for cleansing, spiritual candles, protection amulets, folk healing traditions, rituals blending indigenous and Catholic beliefs. And what's interesting is this. For many people in Mexico, spirituality is not separated from daily life. You buy groceries, and maybe right next to them, something for protection, healing, or cleansing. And that blend of old beliefs surviving quietly inside modern life is something you begin noticing everywhere in Mexico. Once your eyes adjust to it, simple like that. Some places Mexico feels mystical, not because of rituals, but because of how deeply connected they are to nature. Rancho Sagrado is one of those places. A place to slow down, to breathe, to reconnect with nature and simple things again. Coffee, cacao, medicinal plants, jungle sounds, rain, silence. And honestly, places like this reminds of how disconnected modern life has made us from the natural world. What I love about Rancho Sagrado is that it doesn't try too hard. It simply exists. And maybe that's why it feels authentic. You don't leave places like this with souvenirs. You leave much calmer. And I think that's something many people are secretly searching for when they travel, even if they don't realize it. And maybe that's the real magic of Mexico. Not the ancient beliefs survived, but that they never fully separated from everyday life. They still exist inside foods, inside rituals, inside villages, inside music, markets, inside family traditions and the way people speak about nature and energy. And once you begin seeing those layers, Mexico stops feeling like just a country. It starts feeling like a living cultural universe. And maybe that's why traveling through Mexico feels so different from many other countries, because eventually you realize the magic is not always in the destination. Sometimes it's in the vibe surrounding it, the conversations, the weather changing on the road, the tiny places you never planned to stop at, the old woman selling fruits on the roadside, the music playing somewhere in the distance while a fog slowly rolls through the mountains. And honestly, some of my strangest memories from Mexico are not connected to famous places at all. They happened between them, on roads, because Mexico reveals itself very differently when you stop rushing from attraction to attraction, when you stop trying to compete and complete the country like a checklist. And instead, you allow the road itself to become part of the experience. One thing I have learned over the years of traveling in Mexico is this: if you rush through the country, you miss almost everything. Because Mexico is not a country designed for speed. It's a country designed for observation. And the deeper you travel into it, the more important the roads themselves become. No highways, no fast routes, the slow roads, the roads where fog suddenly appears out of nowhere, dogs sleep in the tiny villages, music leaks from the roadside kitchens, and every turn feels like the beginning of another story. The road through Los Tuxtlas and Veracruz feels almost cinematic. That's what I want to mention you. That's one of the most beautiful roads. I have several more, but this one, you can check it out, especially during the rain or early morning fog. You drive through humid jungle landscapes where banana trees hang over the road and thick green vegetation slowly swallows everything around you. The windows stay open because the air feels alive itself. Sometimes you hear birds, sometimes monkeys, sometimes absolutely nothing. And every now and then, you pass tiny roadside food stand where smoke rises slowly from improvised kitchen under the metal roof. No tourists, no sign saying hidden gem. No, just life continuing quietly somewhere inside the jungle. And honestly, roads like these changed the way I travel because they taught me to stop focusing only on destinations. One of my favorite journeys in all of Mexico starts with a small boat. You leave Catemaco behind and slowly enter the mangroves towards Macapan. The world becomes quieter. Birds move above the water. Mangrove roots disappear into the dark reflections. The boat engine hums softly through the lagoon. And eventually you arrive at what feels like the end of the road, literally. La Parra, a narrow strip of land where the lagoon exists on one side and the Gulf of Mexico crashes on the other. And what I love most about this place is not even the scenery, it's the feeling of abandonment. Forgotten restaurant benches under palm roofs, plastic chairs facing the sea, fresh oysters and seafood arriving straight from the water. And almost nobody there except you. Hours disappear in places like this. Nobody rushes you. Nobody asks for content. Nobody cares about algorithms. You simply sit there listening to waves and wind while eating seafood so fresh it barely feels real. And honestly, this is the Mexico I fell in love with. Not polished Mexico, slow Mexico. Most travelers experience mezcal through trendy bars now. But the real magic often happens in the dusty roads outside Mexico, especially on the routes toward Hierve el Agua in Oaxaca and small villages around Santa Catarina, Minas. And this is where Mexico rewards curiosity, because suddenly you notice tiny roadside palenques hidden between agave fields. No branding, no website, no polished tours, just smoked donkeys standing nearby, clay distillation pots, plastic chairs under trees, and usually an old mezcalero who explains everything slowly while pouring tiny cups of mezcal, mixing with strange herbal infusions you never heard of before. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Some sweet, some smoky drinks, some bitter, some almost medicinal. And what I love about these places, that they still feel human, not industrial. You're not experiencing a product. You're experiencing a family tradition, something passed down through generations. And honestly, half the beauty is not even the mezcal itself. It's the road that led you there. And that road begins climbing higher and higher. Curves through pine forest, cold mountain air entering through the windows, fog swallowing entire villages. And eventually you arrived in San Jose del Pacifico, a small mountain town suspended somewhere between clouds and reality. Some people come here searching for mushrooms, for magic mushrooms, yes. Some for spirituality, some for silence. But honestly, even without any ceremonies or experiences, this place already feels surreal, especially during sunset, because there are moments there when the mountain disappears into fog and the sky turns orange and gold in ways that almost doesn't feel real anymore. And suddenly everyone becomes quiet, even travelers who never stop talking. And maybe that's what I love most about places like San Jose. They remind people how small they are again. But Capulalpam feels completely different. Cleaner, calmer, gentler. A mountain village surrounded by pine forest where life still moves slowly. No big tourism energy, no nightlife chaos. Just wood smoke, quiet streets, cold mornings, and mountain silence. Places like this remind you that Mexico is not always loud. Sometimes it's incredibly peaceful. And honestly, many travelers never discover this version of the country because they move too quickly between famous destinations, and the road into Chiapas mountains feels different again, wilder, more remote, more unpredictable. You drive through mist-covered mountains where tiny villages appear unexpectedly between curves, dogs sleeping in the middle of the road, women selling fruits or tamales from roadside tables, old pickup trucks overloaded with firewood. And the deeper you go, the less modern the world begins to feel, especially on the roads toward Caña and Las Nubes. The jungle slowly becomes thicker, the air warmer, the distance is longer, and this is where Mexico starts rewarding patience, because eventually you stop asking, how much longer until we arrive? And instead, you begin enjoying the movement itself. The road, the vibe, the transitions. There's a particular feeling that appears when you finally reach places like La Caña and Las Nubes. Not excitement, relief maybe. Like you traveled far enough to finally disconnect from noise. Roads like these force you to slow down. And maybe that's important, because modern travel often teaches people to consume places quickly. Mexico teaches the opposite. It teaches patience, observation, presence. And honestly, I think that's one of the reasons why this country emotionally affects so many people. Not because it's perfect, but because it constantly asks you to move slower, to pay attention, to notice details. And eventually, once you start traveling Mexico this way, the road itself becomes unforgettable. And maybe that's why Mexico feels so different from many places people travel to. Because here, the journey changes your rhythm. You begin slower, you notice more, you stop rushing from landmark to landmark trying to collect places like trophies, and eventually you realize something important. The most powerful moment really happen in the most famous places. Sometimes they happen completely alone. No crowds, no tour buses, no noise, just you standing somewhere ancient trying to process the feeling of it. And honestly, history feels very different when nobody else is around, especially in Mexico, because some places here don't feel abundant. They feel hidden, like they quietly survived, while the modern world got distracted somewhere else. Most travelers visiting Mexico know names like Chichen Itza, Teotihuacan, maybe Palenque, and yes, they're impressive. But some of the strangest ancient places I've experienced in Mexico were the ones almost nobody talks about. Places where you hear wind instead of crowds, where jungle slowly swallows stone, where you sit alone on top of the pyramid wondering how this place still feels so invisible to the world. And maybe that's the magic, because ancient Mexico feels completely different once silence returns to it. The first time I climbed Tonina in Chiapas, I remember stopping halfway up just to breathe. Not because of exertion, because of the vibe again. Tonina doesn't feel like touristic attraction at all. It feels powerful, massive stone terraces rising above the jungle, very few people. Wind moving through the ruins, clouds slowly drifting above the mountains. And unlike many famous archaeological sites, there's space here, silence. You can actually sit down and observe the place instead of fighting through crowds and cameras. And honestly, I think ancient sites are supposed to feel this way. Not rushed, not consumed, felt. Then there is Tenampuente, one of those places where you almost start questioning whether tourism simply forgot it exists. No crowds, no big souvenir markets, no influencer photo lines. Just ancient stone structures quietly sitting above green valleys in Chiapas. And honestly, that solitude changed everything. Because suddenly you notice details. The sound of insects, the heat on the stone, the scale of surrounding mountains. Places like Tenam Puente remind you how much modern tourism changes the way we experience history. Because when nobody else is around, ancient places stop feeling like attractions and start feeling real again. Some ruins impress you with size. Balamku is different. It surprises you with intimacy. Deep inside the lesser-known Mayan site near Calakmul are some of the most extraordinary preserved stucco murals in the Mayan world. And entering the dark protective structure around them feels almost ceremonial, quiet, dimly lit, mysterious. You stand there staring at faces and symbols and stories created centuries ago. And somehow it feels more emotional than standing in front of giant pyramids, because suddenly the ancient world becomes personal, detailed, human. And then there is moments in Mexico that don't even feel real anymore. Near Calakmul, not far from Balamku, there's a bat cave hidden deep in the jungle. At first it feels quiet, almost too quiet, but then suddenly thousands and thousands of bats explode out of the cave into the evening sky like black smoke, endless movement, chaos, sound, and everybody watching becomes silent, because nature sometimes creates spectacles more powerful than anything humans ever built. And standing there surrounded by jungle darkness, you suddenly understand how alive this region still is. Not just historically, ecologically, spiritually, in any way possible. What I love about places like Xochitl and Chicana is that they still feel adventurous to reach. That's another to mark. Not difficult, but undiscovered, especially Xochitl. That enormous monster mouth temple entrance almost looks surreal emerging from the jungle, like architecture from ancient world. And at Chicana, the jungle feels incredibly close to the ruins itself. Bird sounds everywhere, humidity, silence between structures. And because there are so few people, your imagination starts filling the gaps. You stop seeing these places as archaeological sites and begin seeing them as lost cities, slowly returning to nature. Earlier I mentioned briefly on Cuicuilco in Mexico City, but emotionally this place belongs in this chapter too, because Cuicuilco represents something fascinating. The ancient world hidden underneath modern Mexico. People drive past it every day without realizing they're beside one of the oldest pyramid structures in the country. And maybe that's symbol of Mexico itself. Ancient history here isn't separated from modern life, as I mentioned already. It exists underneath it, constantly and quietly. Most travelers visiting Puebla never hear about Yoalechan, which honestly feels crazy once you arrive there. Green hills, ancient pyramids, very few visitors. And what I remember most is not even the structures themselves, but again, the stillness. You can hear wind moving through the valley, and for a moment, time becomes difficult to measure there. Mexico still surprises me after all these years, and Comalcalco is one of those surprises. Because unlike most Mayan sites built from limestone, Comalcalco was built using bricks. Bricks. The first time I visited, that detail completely changed the atmosphere for me. It suddenly felt different from every other Maya sites I ever visited. And maybe that's what keeps Mexico endlessly fascinating. Even after years of traveling through it, it still keeps revealing unexpected versions of itself. And then Mexico becomes strange again. Very strange. Here is one. Deep in Yucatan Peninsula is Cantemo Cave, a place where snakes literally hanging from the cave ceiling waiting to catch bats flying out into the darkness. Even describing it sounds unreal. You walk through darkness and humidity while guides lead you deeper and deeper underground. And eventually you stand there watching one of the weirdest natural phenomena imaginable. And honestly, this is the kind of experience that completely changes people's understanding of Mexico, because suddenly Mexico is no longer beaches, resorts, tacos. It becomes wild, unpredictable, mysterious, and alive. Some places are beautiful, some places feels unreal. Arco del Tiempo in Chiapas belongs in the second category. Remote jungle, river crossings, massive canyon walls, and eventually one of the largest natural stone arches in the world, appearing almost impossible inside that landscape. The first time I saw it, I remember not speaking for a while. I was just sitting there, breathing and trying to process the scale, silence, and isolation all at once. And honestly, I think that's something modern travel really gives people anymore. Moments where your brain generally struggles to observe what it's seeing. No crowds, no music, no distraction, just nature, stone, water, and time. And maybe that's why these forgotten places feel so powerful. Not because they're bigger or more famous, but because they still allow space for imagination, space for silence, space to sit down for a moment and simply feel where you are. And in a world where everything is becoming louder, faster, and more crowded, places like these feel incredibly rare. And after a while, you begin realizing something else about Mexico. The places are only part of the story, because eventually even the most incredible ruins, waterfalls, jungles, and hidden roads start blending together a little. But the people don't. You remember the voice, the laugh, the smell of food cooking, the old man explaining mezcal, the grandmother asking if you want more tortillas even after you already said no 3 times. And honestly, some of the strangest memories I have from Mexico are not connected to landscapes at all. They're connected to people who made places feel alive. Because travel becomes meaningful very differently once you stop chasing attractions and start collecting human moments instead. Right? One thing Mexico does incredibly well is this. It makes strangers feel familiar very quickly. You sit down somewhere random and suddenly somebody is feeding you, telling stories, pouring a drink, or explaining something with their hands because neither of you fully understand the other language. And somehow it still works. The warmth exists everywhere in Mexico, especially once you leave polished tourism behind. And honestly, the older I get, the less interested I become in famous restaurants. I'm more interested in places that feel human, places with atmosphere, imperfections, personality, places that feel alive. One of those places for me is restaurant Tella in Alvarado, Veracruz. And honestly, every time I return there, I feel less like visiting a restaurant and more like returning home. The old grandmas already recognize me. They smile before I even sit down. The place itself is incredible, simple, rustic, raw, nothing fancy at all. No design concept, no Instagram strategy, nothing. No carefully curated aesthetics whatsoever. Just real food and real people. Fresh seafood, plastic tables, fans slowly spinning overhead, conversations echoing through the room, and somehow that simplicity makes it unforgettable. Because places like this reminds you that hospitality doesn't need luxury. Sometimes all it needs is sincerity. Then there's Humos en Los Ojos and San Cristobal de las Casas. And I honestly love this place because it feels like somebody accidentally turned their living room into a restaurant. Simple tables, basic setup, no complicated menu, just a few types of grilled meat cooked over smoke and fire. That's it. And somehow it's incredible. The smell hits you immediately. Smoke, wood, meat slowly grilling. And while trendy restaurants everywhere try to create authentic atmosphere, places like this don't need to try. Because they are authentic. You sit there eating while life continues around you naturally. No performance, no branding. And honestly, those are usually the places I trust the most. Some restaurants in Mexico don't impress you immediately. But El Mayordomo in Chajovites is one of them. If you walked past it quickly, you might never even stop. But that's exactly the point. Mexico constantly rewards curiosity. Places like this are not trying to attract tourists. They simply exist for the people around them. And when you finally sit down there, everything slows. Simple food, warm atmosphere, people talking quietly, fans moving slowly in the heat, and suddenly you realize this is the kind of place you remember years later. Not because of the spectacular, but because it felt real. It was just real as it could. And markets in Mexico is another story. They are more than a market. They're entire worlds. And Mercado Morelos in Oaxaca is one of my favorite examples of this beautiful chaos. Noisy everywhere, smoke from food stalls, fresh ingredients piled on tables, music, people shouting prices and everything. And somehow inside all that movement, there's a woman dressed like Frida Kahlo, serving food with incredible personality and energy. So sweet, she's so charming. And honestly, moments like this are why I love Mexico markets so much. Because every corner feels alive. Yeah, she dressed for tourists. Nothing feels sterile or controlled. And once you stop being overwhelmed by the chaos, you begin noticing details, the smells, the colors, the conversations, the rhythm of daily life. And Cancun is interesting. I will mention Cancun as well, because so much of it feels polished, controlled, and designed for tourism. Beach clubs, resorts, fancy rooftops, perfect lighting everywhere. And then suddenly, you find a place like Caribbean Galeo, a hidden little spot that feels completely disconnected from the polished version of Cancun that most tourists experience. And honestly, I love places like this because they remind me that even inside heavily touristic destinations, there are local places still survive quietly in the background. You just have to look for them. Some of the best meals in Mexico happen inside the markets. As I mentioned, you probably understand already. I have a big passion for markets. And those tiny hidden comedors where workers, drivers, grandmothers, and local sellers and vendors all eat together. No reservations, no created playlists, no influencer menus. Usually, whatever was cooked that morning. Big pots of soup, fresh tortillas, simple plastic chairs. And what I love most about these places is that food in Mexico still feels deeply connected to community. People don't just eat quickly and leave. They sit, talk, rest, observe. And yeah, honestly, I think modern life forgot how important that is. But one of the most beautiful things in southern Mexico is seeing how connected people are still to what they produce. Coffee ranches, cacao farms, small chocolate workshops, places where people explain everything patiently. How coffee is grown, how cacao is fermented, how medicinal plants are used. And suddenly food stops feeling industrial. It becomes personal again, human again. And honestly, those experiences stay with me far more than expensive restaurants ever do. Every Saturday, there is Tianguis in San Cristobal de las Casas, which honestly feels less like a market and more like an entire region suddenly gathering in one place. People arriving from mountain villages, traditional clothing, textiles, food, music, conversations happening in multiple indigenous languages. And what I love most is this. Nothing there feels designed for outsiders. You are simply witnessing life happening. And that changes the energy completely. Because the strangest travel experiences often happen when you stop expecting places to perform for you. And instead, you quietly step into somebody else's world for a while. And maybe that's the biggest lesson Mexico taught me, that the real hidden gems are usually not places at all. They're people, the grandmother remembering your name, the market vendor handling you fruit to try, the mezcalero explaining traditions passed through generations, the family inviting you to sit longer even after dinner is finished. And years later, those are usually the moments you remember most clearly. And maybe that's why I keep returning to Mexico. Not because it's perfect, not because it's easy, but every now and then it gives you moments that feel increasingly rare in modern life. Moments where nobody's rushing you, nobody's selling you anything, nobody cares about notifications, schedules, or content. Just silence, nature, night sounds, fire, wind, water. And honestly, I think many people travel without realizing what they're actually searching for. Not luxury, not attractions, not even adventure sometimes, but disconnection, real disconnection. The kind where your nervous system finally slows down enough to notice simple things again. And Mexico still has places where that feeling exists. You just need to know where to look. And some places Mexico don't impress you immediately. There's no dramatic entrance, no famous landing, no famous landmark, no giant wow moment. Instead, they slowly quiet your mind. After a few hours there, you suddenly realized you haven't checked your phone, you haven't thought about work, you haven't rushed anywhere. You've simply been present. And honestly, those places become some of the most valuable places in my life. Rancho Escondido is one of those places. And honestly, it's difficult to explain why it feels so special. Because objectively, it's simple. Pine forest, nature, horses, ducks, tiny green cabins, bonfires, cold nights. That's it, no luxury. No infinity pools, no curated eco experience. And maybe that's exactly why it feels magical. At night, the silence becomes incredibly deep. And above you, billions of stars. And for a while, the modern world disappears completely. No city noises, no stress, no performance, just firewood cracking in the dark and cold mountain air moving through the trees. I have a very personal connection to this place, a long history with it. And honestly, it's one of those places I almost don't want to share publicly, because places like this survive through quietness. But if somebody generally wants to disconnect from the world for a few days, this is one of the first places that comes to my mind. But let's go back to Cancun for a while. And people hear Cancun immediately imagine resorts, party, hotels, tourist chaos. But north of all that, there's Isla Blanca. And it feels like another country entirely. Long empty beaches, wind, kite surfers in the distant silence. No massive hotel walls blocking the horizon. And what I love most is how strange the contrast feels. One side, one of the most touristic regions in Latin America, the other, empty beaches where you can walk for ages barely seeing anyone. And honestly, this is the version of Cancun most travelers never discover because they never leave the hotel zone. And Xalac feels like the edge of Mexico. The road becomes quieter, the village smaller, the tourism disappears almost completely, and eventually you arrive in this sleepy Caribbean fishing village where life still moves on at its own pace. No big beach clubs, no influencer crowds, no nightlife, just ocean wind, boats, palm trees, and unbelievably calm mornings. Places like Xalac reminds me how different Caribbean feels once tourism stops controlling the atmosphere. And honestly, this is probably closer to what the Riviera Maya felt like decades ago. Chiapas has many waterfalls, but places like Las Nubes, I mentioned earlier, and Roberto Barrio still feel softer and less consumed than many famous ones. Especially early in the mornings, mist about the water, jungle sounds everywhere. Nobody talking loudly. There's something deeply calming about sitting beside moving water in remote places. Time slows naturally there. No agenda, no pressure, just jungle river sounds. And honestly, modern life really allows people to experience this kind of stillness anymore. The Oaxaca coast changes people's rhythm very quickly, especially once you move beyond the more famous beach towns. Places like Playa Estacahuite and Playa Las Boquilla still feel sleepy, local, and wonderfully unpolished. Fishermen preparing boats in the morning, small seafood restaurants, dogs sleeping under the palms in shadow, nobody rushing. And honestly, the Pacific coast teaches you how little humans actually need to feel good. Sunset, ocean air, fresh fish, hammock, silence. That's enough, right? And Laguna Guerrero feels almost hidden behind Riviera Maya. No loud tourism, no giant beach clubs, just calm lagoon, water surrounded by mangroves, and small local life. And what I love most about places like this is the emotional contrast they create. Because people arrive in Quintana Roo expecting stimulation, and suddenly they discover tranquility instead. Ventanilla is another place that quietly slows people down. Mangroves, crocodiles, birds, tiny boats moving slowly through still water. And everything there happens at nature's pace, not yours. And honestly, I think that's something deeply healing. Modern life constantly demands attention. Places like Ventanilla asks for observation instead. And how about places where silence feels almost spiritual? Romerillo, during Day of the Dead, is one of those places. Candles, mountain air, families gathering quietly in the cemetery. No tourism performance, just remembrance. And honestly, experiences like this completely changed the way I understand Day of the Dead. Not as a colorful festival for tourists, but as something intimate, emotional, secret. And standing there quietly watching candles flicker in the mountain darkness, you suddenly understand something important about Mexico. This country is deeply connected to memory, to ancestors, to rituals, to silence. And maybe that's why places like this affect people so deeply. Because they remind us of emotions modern life constantly tries to distract us from. And maybe that's the final hidden side of Mexico. Not adventure, not ruins, not food, not beaches, but stillness. The ability to disconnect from noise long enough to finally hear yourself think again. And honestly, that's maybe one of the rarest luxuries left in the modern world. And maybe that's the most beautiful thing about Mexico. No matter how many years you spend there, it never fully reveals itself. There's always another road, another village, another hidden food stand, another strange story, another person you randomly meet who changes your entire experience of a place. And honestly, what I shared tonight is only a tiny fraction of it. There are so many places, stories, and moments I had to leave out because Mexico is simply too layered, too emotional, and too alive to fit into one webinar. And maybe that's exactly why people fall in love with it. Not because it's perfect, but because it constantly surprises you. At some point during my years traveling through Mexico, I stopped trying to see everything. I stopped chasing checklists, stopped trying to conquer the country like a traveler collecting destinations. And that's when Mexico finally opened itself to me. Because Mexico is not a checklist. It's conversations, roads, silence, smells, fog rolling through mountains, music leaking into the streets at night, jungle rain or metal roofs, old women serving food with a smile, dogs sleeping in tiny villages, bonfires under pine trees, unexpected conversations, and moments you never planned for. That's the Mexico I fell in love with. And honestly, if you ever travel there slowly enough, you'll eventually discover your version of it too. Not mine, yours. Maybe it will happen in a tiny market, maybe on a jungle road, maybe inside a quiet church, maybe during a random conversation over coffee or mezcal somewhere far away from tourist routes. But if you allow Mexico to surprise you, it usually will. And if after tonight you feel curious about visiting Mexico differently, beyond resorts, beyond tourist traps, beyond the obvious places, and you want help planning it, discovering hidden places, or creating a more authentic route, send me a message. I'll genuinely be happy to help. Because more than anything, I want people to experience the Mexico that made me fall in love with this country in the first place. And maybe the biggest lesson Mexico ever taught me was this. Mexico changed me for when I stopped trying to conquer it as a traveler and started allowing it to surprise me. So thank you, and see you in Mexico.